Hello, this is Matt, and welcome to a mini-episode from the No Fear Cast. Ordinarily, this would be exclusive for our Patreon $5 a month donors, but we decided that this conversation was so good that we would share it with everyone for free. And maybe it'll entice those of you who are on the fence to possibly become one of our Patreon donors. But even if not, we hope you enjoy it. It goes along with our last main episode, The Day of the Triffids, and is a brief master of horror on the author John Wyndham.
So today we're talking about John Wyndham, author of The Day of the Triffids, and we were actually laughing right before we hit record on this because I think he has one of the longest names given to a sci-fi author. His name is, I may stumble over this, John Wyndham Parks Lucas Binion Harris. So that is a total of 6 names, and he used a variation of those names when he published. So for instance, sometimes he used Harris, sometimes Lucas, sometimes Binion. He kind of did different combinations of them as he was first publishing, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Who is John Wyndham? He lived in the early half of the 1900s. He was an English science fiction writer. And again, I've said he published under various pen names. Some of his earliest works came out in the 1930s, including a book called The Secret People, which came out in 1935, a book called Foul Play Suspected, also in 1935, and then another book called Planet Plane in 1936. So they came out right around the same time. And he also wrote a lot of short stories. I won't go into all those names, but they are collected in various anthologies and collections. So some of them are still circulating today. But in World War II, he served with the Ministry of Information and then later with the Royal Corps of Signals, I believe. And he was actually involved in the immediate aftermath of Normandy, I think. But Mel, I don't know, do you know a little bit more about what he did in World War II?
Sure, I could talk a little bit about what he did in World War II and then kind of how his writing changed after the war. Because one interesting thing in his career is that his pre-World War II fiction, while varied, was not as popular as his post-war fiction. He wrote a lot of sci-fi adventures, some fantasy stuff about flights to Mars, some ecological stuff, which kind of hints at Triffids to come. But because there wasn't a huge sci-fi market in Britain at the time, he was publishing a lot of stories in American magazines like Wonder Stories, etc. But in World War II, as you said, Lisa, he was in the Ministry of Information where he did some work as a censor. And then he was a cipher operator for the signalman, a cipher operator for the Royal Corps. And he was not initially in the Normandy landing, like the first days of the operation. He was involved later in that particular piece of history. And one of the articles I read about him said that he had talked about how he kind of felt out of time when he was in World War II. He was born in 1903, and I think from certain things I was reading that he had kind of thought when he was in his mid to late teens that he would be involved in the First World War, and that ended up not happening. And then, of course, there's this other world conflagration. And so he had this weird kind of, he said, like feeling out of time or almost deja vu, which is interesting because he had a few time travel stories actually after World War II that he wrote. Post-war, he went back to writing. His brother had some success writing, and so he wanted to try his hand at it again. And he kind of, as you were saying before we started recording, Lisa, reinvented himself in a way. He stuck with the name John Wyndham for the first time, and he published a spate of books that became quite successful. And I think this was something I was thinking about when we were doing the podcast on Day of the Triffids. I think that maybe there's a couple things going on in his work. I think he's kind of combining the post-World War II period in history. So you have obviously hopes for the future, but you also have a lot of fears. You have a lot of worry about the world surviving after 2 wars. We talked in the podcast about how he kind of anticipated the Cold War at the very beginning of it. And I think he was very much interested in this idea of like Western civilization surviving in the midst of this possible atomic conflagration. And so he insinuates himself in a way into what people call cozy catastrophe or cozy apocalypse novels. So he writes about these kind of disasters, whether they're related to nature, aliens, or humans evolving too quickly, or possible nuclear issues, and traces as middle-class people in Britain respond to these things. And so cozy catastrophe was something that had been being written since late 1800s. I saw a mention of Richard Jefferies' book After London or Wild England. But Wyndham kind of revamped it, expanded it, and he also played off of H.G. Wells, which was one of his big influences. Wyndham called it logical fantasy, where basically he and Wells believed that you write a realistic book or story, but you introduce one weird or fantastic thing. So Day of the Triffids is your basic apocalypse story, but the strange thing is that the Triffids, might be sentient, or the Kraken Wakes is about the end of the world, but it introduces the possibility that aliens could have had something to do with it. So everything seems normal. It's not like you're thrown into a fantasy world, but there's just something weird that starts to affect everyone. And I don't know what you guys think, but that could also possibly be a hangover from the war as well.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought up the H.G. Wells connection, because that is something that I had taken note of, and I meant for us to bring up in the Day of the Triffids, and we didn't get a chance to talk about it because we were just, that episode was so full with other information, which is one reason we wanted to do this mini episode, was to kind of cover some things we didn't get a chance to cover first. But I think especially the way you described it with talking about the War of the Worlds, but in specifically a post-World War II, pre-Cold War era. It fits as far as the description, especially for the Day of the Triffids, almost perfectly, because there is, if you want to call it a realistic fantasy element to it. But at the same time, it's hitting at different societal anxieties that I think H.G. Wells wasn't aware of or couldn't have been aware of because they didn't exist at the time. But Wyndham really has his pulse on British society and its fears and anxieties. And if you read carefully enough, and certainly in The Day of the Triffids, and I suspect in some of his other books, that you'll get a sense of that.
I don't know about you guys, but I just love this term cozy catastrophe, because on the one hand, I feel like a Day of the Triffids and even the Kraken Wakes, there are some violent moments, and we look at things that maybe we wouldn't want to look at. But there's also a lot of, I think, as Alistair said in the main podcast, like the world is ending slightly off stage, or like we're so focused on the folks we're traveling with. And I don't know. It made me think of like cozy mysteries that I enjoy reading. But for all its coziness and for all we're going to survive in the end, I feel like, I don't know how you guys felt when you were reading Triffids in particular, but I feel a fear in it too. There's always the chance throughout the book that everything can fall apart. I feel like I don't know that I feel as safe as that term maybe would suggest, because that is how the world will end, I think. Lisa, you mentioned that in the main podcast, like terrible things happen and we watch it the 24-hour news cycle and then we just forget about whatever it was. And who knows that 6 months later, whatever that thing was isn't maybe the downfall, but we just don't have time. We're too busy with and we all do this, but we're like too busy texting or being online, or that we wouldn't even notice when the end of the world was happening. And I almost feel like his like everyday blasé-ness maybe about the end of the world happening is more realistic than I think the term cozy catastrophe lets on. I don't know. What do you guys think?
Yeah, that's a strange term for me as well, because I had never heard that term before. The first time I encountered it was when we were preparing for this, for the main episode on the Day of the Triffids. And like you, Mel, I had connected it to the term cozy mystery. And yeah, I agree with you that even though I think he wants to give us a hopeful ending, that you see a peaceful society starting to reform, or at least the idea that it could, especially with the Day of the Triffids, because they kind of overthrow the feudal system pretty rapidly. But there is still that sense, as you said, that everything is not okay, because after all, the Triffids are still there And it can only be cozy in the sense of understanding that most of the world is gone. Most of the population is gone, or they're blind, or, they've been taken out by disease. So there is that unsettling nature. But one thing that I think fits the term cozy is maybe his, as you said, it happens just off stage. So you don't get those scenes of real violence or bloodshed. You may hear characters talk about it, or if something is confronted on the page, it's done so very, very quickly. I think a really good example of that is if you look at something like the Midwich Cuckoos and then the 1995 John Carpenter version of that, because he kind of had to add in a lot of the violence. And it's from what I understand, a very faithful adaptation, but he brought the violence on stage because in a cozy, you don't do that. You don't show it. So there is that sense of safety and that you're not confronted with it constantly in the way you would in, say, like the horror genre. But at the same time, it's always there. And that may even more ramp up the anxiety in a lot of these stories, which is the complete antithesis to the term cozy to begin with.
One of the other things I think is interesting about him that I don't know that we talked about, his anticipation in some ways of climate change. Like, even Day of the Triffids, and with the animals disappearing and then coming back, and the Kraken Wakes at the end, everybody lives on the top of mountains because the polar ice caps have been melted. It just seems so interesting. I don't know. It seems interesting to me when I read his books how kind of portentous he was, or how he kind of saw what could happen very early in the atomic age. I don't know if that's worth a mention or not, but it's something that I find interesting about him.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I'm actually glad that you mentioned it and brought it up, because he does anticipate a lot of, I think, what we would consider modern problems or modern issues. When we've talked about the 50s, especially before, even the early 60s, usually what you're talking about are, Cold War fears or you mentioned the atomic age, and there really it seems to be no sense of the ecological crisis that's to come. Not as you would get in something that would come maybe like in the 70s or later, maybe even, the 90s. But you certainly wouldn't think of the 50s when you think of an ecological horror or a worry that could be what brings about the end of the world. Usually in the novels at the same time, you're dealing with an atomic bomb or biological warfare or aliens. And so it's interesting to think, and that reading certainly is there, The Day of the Triffids, that it is some sort of ecological apocalypse that's happening.
I mean, even in his book, The Chrysalids, that came out in 1955, it talks about how the climate has become warmer and more hospitable in places that were colder before and less in places that were very hot. And of course, that could be a side effect of nuclear war, of course, but that's still climate change, right? Affected by people. And I would be interested in knowing how many people writing around the same time period would pay that much attention to the climate versus just having us blow ourselves up or survive afterward. It just seems like he anticipated all the problems that would happen, from the climate changing to plagues happening to, there's so much going on in Triffids that people don't really think about that it would happen if the world was ending, right? I mean, all those sorts of things would be going on.
Right. Well, even anticipating, gender issues. We talked about that a little bit in the Day of the Triffids episode, where, he seems to write Josella as a very sympathetic character. And even though the main character, doesn't always see how powerful she is and how independent she is and how capable she is of taking care of herself, Wyndham makes sure that the reader sees that. And it's the same way in the Midwich Cuckoos, which we mentioned this in the main episode, but it's worth mentioning that when we talk about that, we're probably more familiar, if you've seen the movie versions, The Village of the Damned, which came out in 1960, or again, that John Carpenter remake in 1995. And then there was also a Children of the Damned in 1963. And the John Carpenter one is the one I'm most familiar with. But the book itself follows that plot pretty well. There's a small town everyone loses consciousness for some reason they don't know, and all the women wake up pregnant. 9 months later, alien children who have this like hive mind and can control things with their mind are there. There's a very iconic, they're all these like towhead children with dark eyes. It's a good, I enjoy the movie, but it's a good image. But that book heavily influenced Margaret Atwood. When she wrote about this in her introduction to one of Wyndham's later novels, Chalky, which came out in 1968. But she was talking about the Midwich Cuckoos, and she called it pre-birth control anxiety. And anyone who's familiar with Margaret Atwood's writing, you can see the direct line that would go from a book like that to, say, The Handmaid's Tale. And this fear of that a woman won't have control over her own body or her own reproductive cycle. And for him to write something like that in 1957, I think that's worth a mention, because that's like the ecological apocalypse. I think that's something that was definitely ahead of its time.
Yeah, when you're talking about the Midwich Cuckoos, and I believe this was how it was in the book as opposed to the original movie Village of the Damned, the aliens come down and actually impregnate the women while everybody is unconscious. And you have one, like you were saying, Lisa, control of the women's bodies. So the women's bodies become like the battlefield through which like Earth and whoever these people are playing out their quote unquote war. But you also have something that was played up in both movies. Played up is maybe too strong a word, but something that's there and is also there in the book is the judgment, social judgment upon these women for, even though everybody was unconscious and everybody knows something happened, the fact that the women all wake up pregnant, it's a traumatic kind of societal thing that these women are basically, they're not married, so they must be virgins, and now all of a sudden they're pregnant. And that's a lot of really interesting and heavy material that for someone to be dealing with in 1957. It makes sense how they would cut some of that stuff a little bit in the movies.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we can tell with the adaptation of the Atwood novel, it's something that still strikes a chord with modern audiences. So for someone to have written essentially the same themes, or at least common themes, back in 57 is something that is really interesting. Similarly, and I haven't read this novel, but I just read a little bit about it today, and now I want to read it. But Wyndham wrote a book called Trouble with Lichen in 1960. And the premise, kind of like Triffids, sounds a bit funny. They find this fungi that can extend life, stop the aging process, so humans can now live for 200 to 300 years. And this woman immediately opens like a spa where she's selling it to women. And people just assume that she's doing it because of the profit. But they find out later that she is worried that once this thing becomes public knowledge, it's going to become a political fight, and that the men are basically going to hold it for power against the women. And so, again, playing up on the idea of gender politics is something I think that's pretty fantastic for 1960. And it makes me want to read the book despite a little bit of a silly premise.
As we wrap up here, I just wanted to mention his final book that came out, I think, was it a year before he passed away, was Chalky. And that's the book that you mentioned earlier, Lisa, that Margaret Atwood wrote an introduction for. And just the basic kind of gist of Chalky is that this boy has an imaginary friend. Turns out that his imaginary friend is actually kind of invisible alien consciousness. And of course, like most Wyndham novels, the government becomes involved with possibly negative intentions. But Chalky is evidently trying to investigate humanity, and it's unclear as to whether he's actually searching for a new place to live, or maybe he just wants to help human beings. And so Atwood points out that at one point point, Chucky goes on a little lecture about how fossil fuels are dirtying the environment and humans need to stop using them. And I think he also lectures them a bit about war. And a couple bits of trivia about this is Atwood speculates at the end of the article that we read that perhaps Chucky had influenced the idea of E.T., the child becoming friends with an alien, which is interesting because people have pointed out that in the movie E.T., a Triffid appears. And Lisa was mentioning that Steven Spielberg holds the rights to Chucky if Chucky ever becomes a film. So there's a lot of really interesting connections there. That Wyndham is still affecting our entertainment industry even today.
Well, I guess that brings this episode to a close. So once again, thank you for your support of this podcast. And we also would love to say just one more big thank you to our guest hosts from Pseudopod, Alex and Alistair. It was fantastic conversation, and we would love to do it again sometime in the future, assuming they're willing as well. So thank you for listening.